If you want to understand how a father can be erased in under 10 seconds, it starts with a plain white envelope. No shouting, no courtroom, no final argument. Just paper. And my name was already crossed out. He handed it to me with both hands, the way people do when they want to look respectful without actually feeling it. We were sitting in the small visitation room of the nursing home. Beige walls, a plastic plant in the corner, the low hum of an air conditioner that never quite worked right. The kind of place where time doesn't pass so much as it waits. "Dad," he said, clearing his throat, "I need you to read this." That alone should have told me something was wrong. When your son needs you to read instead of listen, it means he doesn't want to hear your voice afterward. I took the envelope. It was lighter than I expected. No seal. Already opened. That detail wouldn't hit me until later. I slid the paper out and read the first line. "Dad, I'm not your son." No explanation, no softening, just a sentence, clean and sharp, like it had been written to cut, not to communicate. For a moment, I honestly thought it was some kind of mistake, a legal mix-up, a document meant for someone else that had found its way into my hands. That's how the mind protects itself when the truth comes too fast. I looked up at him. He didn't meet my eyes. "This is for legal reasons," he said. "It doesn't change anything personally." That was the first lie. When someone tells you something doesn't change anything, it already has. I went back to the page. There was more. Language I didn't recognize, not the way my son used to write emails or birthday cards. Tight sentences, cold phrasing. Words like hereby and acknowledge. The kind of language that doesn't come from the heart. It comes from an office. My hands didn't shake. I noticed that. I'd always thought this was the kind of moment that would make a man fall apart. Instead, everything inside me went quiet, like a room after the lights are switched off. "You don't have to sign anything," he added quickly. "This is just documentation." Documentation. That's what my life with him had been reduced to. A folder. A form. A line item someone wanted closed. I thought about all the things I'd never documented. The nights I stayed up teaching him fractions at the kitchen table. The overtime shifts I took so he wouldn't have to work during college. The checks I wrote without keeping copies because fathers don't keep receipts on love. None of that was on the page in my hands. I folded the letter once, carefully. The way you do when something matters, even if it hurts. Around us, the room stayed the same. The air conditioner hummed. A nurse laughed somewhere down the hall. Life, apparently, had decided to go on without asking my permission. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I didn't ask why, because I could already feel the answer waiting behind his silence. I just looked at my son. No, the man who used to be my son, and realized something that landed heavier than the words themselves. This wasn't written for me. I was just the last person who needed to be informed. That was the moment the story truly began. Not a revenge story fueled by rage or shouting, but something colder, quieter, and far more permanent. And I hadn't said a single word yet. I didn't notice the envelope was already open at first. That came later, after the words had time to sink in, after my mind stopped trying to protect me from what my eyes had clearly read. In the moment, all I could think was how thin the paper felt, how something that light could carry enough weight to change a man's entire life. My son sat across from me, hands folded, posture stiff. He looked like someone waiting for a meeting to end, not like a boy who once ran into my arms with skinned knees and tears on his face. He kept glancing at the clock on the wall, the one shaped like a smiling sun. I'd always hated that clock. Nothing about time ever smiled. "This doesn't mean I don't care about you," he said finally. "It's just paperwork. Something my lawyer said we needed to clean up." Clean up. That phrase landed wrong. You clean up spills. You clean up mistakes. You don't clean up a father. I looked back down at the letter, forcing myself to read it more carefully. That's when I saw it. The crease near the corner, too sharp to be accidental. The faint indentation of a paperclip that had been attached and removed. The envelope hadn't been sealed because it had already been opened. Somewhere else. By someone else. Not me. The realization didn't hit like a punch. It was quieter than that. Colder. Like stepping into water you didn't know was freezing until your feet were already numb. This wasn't a conversation he had decided to have today. This was a process that had already happened. I was just the last step. "You've shown this to someone already," I said, more to myself than to him. He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "They needed a copy," he replied. "That's all." That's all. I nodded slowly, as if I understood. Maybe, in a way, I did. When a man reaches a certain age, he learns the difference between what's being said and what's being avoided. Around us, the room stayed painfully ordinary. A volunteer pushed a cart of crossword books down the hallway. Somewhere nearby, a television played a game show. Laughter floated in from a different visiting room, someone else's family still intact. I wondered, not for the first time, how many other fathers were sitting in chairs like mine, being quietly erased while the world carried on without noticing. If you're listening to this and you're a parent, especially if you're older, I want you to think about something for a moment. Have you ever had a conversation where the other person had clearly made up their mind long before they sat down with you? You don't have to answer out loud. Just think about it. Most of us have been there. I folded the letter again, carefully, and slid it back into the envelope. "So," I said, keeping my voice steady, "what happens now?" He let out a breath, like he'd been waiting for me to get to that part. "Now we move forward, separately. It's better this way." Better for who, I wondered, but I didn't ask. What struck me most wasn't the cruelty of the words. It was the absence of something I'd expected to feel. Anger, maybe, or disbelief. Instead, there was a strange clarity settling in, the kind that comes when you finally understand that you're not part of the plan anymore. As he stood to leave, he paused, hand on the back of the chair. For a fleeting second, I thought he might say something real, something human. He didn't. The door closed behind him with a soft click. That was when I noticed my hands were resting calmly in my lap. That was also when I understood something else, something important. I wasn't being abandoned in that room. I had already been processed. And once you understand that, the rest of the story, every choice that follows, becomes painfully clear. People like to say love is priceless. That's true, right up until the moment someone starts itemizing it. After my son left that day, I stayed in the chair for a long time, staring at the empty space across from me. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee. I tried to remember when giving to him stopped feeling like love and started being treated like background noise. It hadn't happened all at once. It never does. When he was little, giving was simple. Lunch money slipped into a backpack. new cleats when the old ones wore through. Late nights at the kitchen table, me pretending not to yawn while he struggled through homework. None of that felt like sacrifice. It felt like purpose. Later it got heavier, but I carried it anyway. When he was in his 20s and ready to buy his first house, the bank wouldn't approve the loan without a larger down payment. He called me late one night, voice tight, trying to sound calm. "Dad, I just need a little help to get over the line." I sold the old woodworking shop my father had left me, the place where I'd learned to use my hands, where I'd spent weekends fixing what other people threw away. I told myself it was just wood and walls. What mattered was my son having a future. I handed in the money without hesitation. Years later, when his business started wobbling, he came back again. Different tone this time. Less hope, more pressure. "If this fails," he said, "everything fails." I transferred more funds. I didn't ask for paperwork. I didn't ask for guarantees. Fathers aren't supposed to ask those kinds of questions, are they? I never once said, "You owe me." I never once said, "Remember this." That was my mistake. Because somewhere along the way, my giving stopped being seen as love and started being seen as entitlement. Something expected. Something assumed. Something that didn't need acknowledgement. In the letter I'd just read, there was no mention of any of it. No memory of the shop. No late nights. No risk. No trust. Just a clean, cold sentence severing the connection, as if none of it had ever existed. I realized then that my life had been reduced to footnotes, financial assistance provided, support during early adulthood, no ongoing obligation. That was the translation. That's how it reads when love is filtered through legal language. What hurt most wasn't the money. It was the realization that every time I'd said, "Don't worry about it," he'd heard, "It didn't matter." Every time I'd chosen silence over gratitude, I'd taught him that silence was acceptable in return. I sat there, hands folded, replaying moments I'd once been proud of. Not because I regretted them, but because I finally understood how invisible they'd become. He hadn't just taken what I gave, he'd erased the giving itself. And that's when the truth settled in, slow and heavy. You can survive losing money. You can survive losing a house. But when your own child looks at a lifetime of sacrifice and decides it counts as nothing, that's a different kind of loss. That's when you stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" and start asking a far more dangerous question. Why am I still paying for something that's already been denied? By the time I stood up to leave that room, something inside me had shifted. Not anger, not bitterness, clarity. And once clarity arrives, it doesn't leave quietly. The first humiliation wasn't loud. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene anyone else could point to later and say, "That's when everything changed." That's the dangerous thing about it. The moments that do the most damage are often quiet enough to be dismissed. It happened a week after the envelope. I was sitting at the front desk of the nursing home, waiting for a package my son said he'd sent. Some old photos, a few documents he claimed I might want. The receptionist was new, a young woman with a practiced smile and a clipboard held tight against her chest. "Name?" she asked. "Walter Coleman," I said. She typed for a moment, frowned slightly, then looked up. "And your relationship to the resident?" I blinked. "I am the resident." She flushed. "Oh, sorry. I meant your emergency contact. Is that your son?" "Yes," I said. "Ethan Coleman." She hesitated again. Then, carefully, "According to our records,
Mr. Coleman requested to be listed as a non-family contact. Non-family. The words were delivered politely, professionally, as if that made them less sharp. I nodded, thanked her, and took a seat. What else was there to do? Argue with a clipboard? That was when it started to sink in. The envelope hadn't just been a letter. It had been a signal.
A switch flipped somewhere outside my view, quietly changing how the world was instructed to see me. Later that afternoon, a nurse knocked on my door. "Mr. Coleman," she said kindly, "we just need you to sign a few forms. Your contact declined to handle medical decisions." Contact. Not son. Not family. I signed where she pointed. My hand was steady. It surprised me how quickly a man can learn to keep his composure when he realizes no one is coming to rescue him. The humiliations stayed small. That was the cruel genius of it. A billing statement arrived addressed only to me, noting that previous guarantor responsibilities had been revised. A care coordinator suggested I review my long-term options, the way people do when they assume you're alone and will stay that way. When my son did call, and the calls grew shorter, more formal, he didn't ask how I was. He asked if the staff was handling things, as if I were a project he'd outsourced. One afternoon, during visiting hours, I overheard him speaking to an administrator in the hallway. He didn't know I was close enough to hear. "My father is independent," he said. "I'm not really involved anymore." Not involved. That sentence did something the letter hadn't. It took the private rejection and made it public, official, repeatable. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. These were the same hands that had worked double shifts, that had signed checks without hesitation, that had held a scared little boy steady on his first bicycle. Now they belonged to a man who needed forms filled out because his own child had stepped away. This is how erasure works, I realized. Not all at once, not dramatically. It starts with titles removed, words changed, roles quietly reassigned until you look around and realize you've been edited out of your own life. No one slapped me. No one raised their voice. They didn't have to. By the end of that week, I understood something clearly. The envelope wasn't the humiliation. It was permission. And now that permission was being used, one small, careful cut at a time. He came back on a Thursday morning. I knew it before the knock. There's a particular kind of knock people use when they don't plan to stay long. Firm, polite, already halfway gone. I opened the door and there he was. My son, standing in the hallway like a visitor instead of family, a slim folder tucked under his arm. "I just need a few minutes," he said. "This is the last thing." The last thing. As if we were closing out a cable account. We sat at the small table by the window. Sunlight fell across the surface, catching every scratch and water ring left by years of quiet meals. He slid the folder toward me, then pulled out a pen and placed it neatly on top, aligning it with the edge like he'd practiced. "These are just final acknowledgments," he said. "Nothing complicated." I opened the folder. The language was clean and careful, the kind of writing that leaves no room for misunderstanding. There it was again, that same tone from the letter. Professional, detached. No room for history. He pointed to the line near the bottom. "Right there." I read it once, then again. By signing, I would acknowledge that he had no further obligation to me, financial, medical, or personal. No duty, no expectation, no responsibility. He didn't rush me. That hurt more than if he had. He just sat there, hands folded, waiting for me to catch up to a decision he'd already made weeks ago. "You sure about this?" I asked. He nodded without hesitation. "It's better this way. Clear. For everyone. For everyone. Not for us." I picked up the pen. It felt heavier than it should have. My name was already printed on the line, typed out neatly, as if the outcome had never been in question. And then, of all things, his phone rang. Not a dramatic ring, not loud, just a bright, cheerful tone that felt wildly out of place in that quiet room. On the screen, I could see it clearly. Dad, incoming call. The ringtone I'd set years ago, back when he was still proud to hear from me. He froze. Completely. His face went blank as his hand fumbled for the phone, knocking the pen off the table. It clattered to the floor, sharp and embarrassing in the silence. For a split second, I almost laughed. Almost. Not because it was funny, but because it was perfect. The kind of moment the world slips in when it wants to remind someone they're pretending a little too hard. He silenced the phone quickly, cheeks flushed. "Sorry," he muttered, avoiding my eyes. "It's fine," I said. And it was, because whatever small protection that ringtone had offered him, it was gone now. The room remembered, even if he wanted to forget. I picked the pen up from the floor and signed. No shaking, no pause. I slid the folder back toward him. He closed it immediately, relief flickering across his face so fast he probably thought I hadn't seen it. "Thank you for understanding," he said, standing already. Understanding. He didn't look back as he left. When the door clicked shut behind him, I stayed where I was, hands resting flat on the table. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel broken. I felt finished. That signature didn't take anything from me I hadn't already lost. It just made the truth official. And once the truth is official, there's nothing left to negotiate. Only consequences waiting quietly for their turn. The room felt different after he left. Not emptier, just clearer, like dust settling after furniture has been moved out, revealing marks on the floor you didn't know were there. I sat at the table for a long time, listening to the air conditioner cycle on and off, replaying the moment over and over. Not to punish myself, but to understand it. Understanding came quietly. It wasn't the signature that did it. I'd already accepted that. What finally broke through was something smaller, sharper. The way he hadn't hesitated. Not once. No pause. No glance toward me. No searching for permission in my face. He hadn't been wrestling with a decision. He'd been executing one. That's when it landed. This wasn't something he'd decided that morning. This wasn't fear or pressure or confusion. This had been planned. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, a maintenance worker was trimming hedges, moving methodically, cutting away anything that didn't fit the line he wanted. I watched the branches fall and thought about the language in the documents. The phrasing I didn't recognize, the precision, the lack of warmth. My son never wrote like that. Even as an adult, his emails had been clumsy, too many commas, a habit of apologizing for things that didn't need apology. That voice wasn't in those pages. Someone else's was. And that meant something else, too. The envelope hadn't been a first step. It had been the last courtesy, a formality extended to me after the real work was done elsewhere. I wasn't being abandoned in that room. I had already been abandoned. Weeks ago, maybe longer. The realization didn't come with rage. It came with a strange relief. Because once you see the truth clearly, you stop bargaining with it. You stop asking what if and maybe. You stop telling yourself stories that make pain easier to carry, but harder to escape. I thought about all the times I'd defended him to friends. He's busy. He's under a lot of pressure. He doesn't mean it. Each excuse had been a small kindness I'd given him. One more thing he hadn't asked for but accepted anyway. That pattern had finally ended. I went back to the table and looked at the empty spot where the folder had been. The absence felt deliberate, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. A period, not a question mark. This was the moment I stopped thinking like a father waiting to be called back and started thinking like a man who had been given an answer. The shift was subtle but permanent. I could feel it in my chest, not hardness, not bitterness, but distance. The kind that allows you to breathe again, the kind that lets you step back without falling. He had made his choice, fully, carefully, in advance. And now, I was finally free to make mine. If you're still with me right now, let me ask you something, just for yourself. Have you ever realized, too late, that a decision affecting your life had already been made without you in the room? You don't need to explain it. You don't need to justify it. Just recognize it. Because that moment, when the truth stops hurting and starts clarifying, is where everything changes. And once it does, there's no going back to who you were before. I turned off the light and sat there in the quiet. For the first time in a long while, I didn't wait for the phone to ring. I didn't wonder what he might say next. I simply sat with the knowledge that something had ended. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the moment before everything finally changed.